We're totally booked.
Rock and roll!
Well, I think I'll leave you to your reading.
Little Hand says it's time to rock and roll.
Rock and roller!
We are totally booked.
Welcome back to Booked on Rock, the podcast for those about to read and rock. Online at bookedonrock.com, exclusive videos, blogs, links to all of the social media sites, including Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. You can find every back episode of Booked on Rock there, along with links to your favorite listening platforms. Tamsin Embleton is this episode's guest. She is the author and editor of a book called Touring and Mental Health, the Music Industry Manual. This book is a must-have for anyone who works in or around the live music business. It's also a fascinating read for those of us who want to know what life is really like on the road. It's not all glamorous. The grueling life on the road can take its toll. Oftentimes, musicians find themselves without the knowledge to handle the physical and psychological stresses that can mount over time. This book offers an in-depth insight into how to manage all of it. Written by experienced healthcare and performance experts, it gives real-life advice, the latest research, and helpful tactics for addressing mental health, performance anxiety, addiction, relationships, physical well-being, diversity, and more. Adding their personal experiences to the book are musicians including Nile Rodgers and Justin Hawkins, along with prominent touring personnel. Touring and Mental Health is designed to be read on the road. Pick it up, pick a section, then put it down after, or read it at length. When you're done, you'll want to pass it around the tour bus. Really looking forward to talking with Tamsin about this book, how it all came about, and how it was all put together. So let's get started. Tamsin Embleton, first off, congratulations to you and everybody who made this book happen. I think this is one that will be talked about in the music community for many, many years to come. So congrats.
Thank you.
In fact, I'm just reading on the back here, Philip Selway of Radiohead, quote, "I wish this book had been around when I first started touring. It should be the first thing we all pack when we head out on the road." Before we get to the book, can you tell us a little bit about your background in music and mental health?
Yeah, sure. So I was primarily a venue and festival booker in the music business. So festivals and venues, and I booked events at a large recording studio. Also did a bit of artist management and a bit of tour management as well. And it was kind of on the road that I started to really piece together what I'd seen backstage and try to, by that point I was in therapy. So I had a bit of a language for what I was seeing, withdrawal and obviously the extreme fatigue and stress responses and pressure to relationships and, all sorts of different things. So when I left the industry, I realized it kind of had been a good fit for a long time, but I realized it was I needed something different. And I spoke to my therapist about it, and we thought that, training to be a therapist would be a good fit for me. I'd always had that kind of confidant role anyway when I was on the road, and certainly when I was working with artists, and that was much more interesting to me. I wanted that kind of, deep connection with people that would create in therapy. So as part of my MA dissertation, around 2016, I started researching the psychological impact of touring. And that came out, well, actually, I never released that research in 2018 because I got this book idea. I was like, right, well, there's nothing out there. There's absolutely nothing by way of guidance. And by that point, we were starting to see more charities having a greater profile, working with musicians' health, performing arts health. But there was nothing at that point, no research about it, about what was happening on the road. People would talk about it, sure, certainly understood by people in the touring community that what the risks are and the lifestyle factors. And, everybody knows someone who's died by suicide, for example, but there was certainly no support. I mean, some tours fare better than others, often when they've got more money and they've learnt the hard way. But
why do you think that is, though, Tamsin? Why after all these years, finally now this book, thanks to you? I mean, why? Because it seems like it would be something that would be addressed.
I think it comes down to money. I think the music industry changes when you hit it in the pocket. It sounds really brutal, but I think that's kind of true. And, there's a greater literacy now around mental health. More artists are talking about it more openly. So those old euphemisms we had, like a friend of mine, Jodie Milstein, and Ryan Dusick, who's a drummer in Maroon 5, is now a therapist. And they're all part of this group that I've set up called Music Industry Therapists Collective. And they both talk a lot about the euphemism exhaustion. You used to see people in the press, oh, so-and-so's got exhaustion, tour exhaustion, and they've gone to rehab or they've gone to hospital or something. And, that is a euphemism for many, many things, many, many breakdowns and burnouts and relapses that happen on the road. So I wanted to put something robust together and started this kind of 4-year journey, whatever it's been, to write the book and bring everyone on board.
Can you talk about how it's laid out? Because as you're right, it's a bit much to read in one setting. So it's designed to dip in and out of. Yeah,
exactly. So we've got 6 sections. And so there's a section that really explains what mental health is, what mental illness is, neurodiversity, the link between mind, brain and body, how mental health develops. So there's a whole section on that. And there's a great chapter, one of my favorite chapters in the book, actually, mental health in the music business. I came across this Geordie Shenton, he's fantastic, and I set him an impossible task. I said, look, I want you to gather all the research we have and analyze it and tell the story of what is happening in the music business. And he managed to do that in like 3,000 words, which I think is remarkable, and analyzed like 100 research studies or something like that. Next section is all about relationships. So group dynamics, what are common issues that occur for bands when they're having problems. So one of those chapters is written by Stan Tatkin over in LA, who's a couples specialist. So he's talking about romantic relationships. He used to be a drummer for the Wrecking Crew, which I think is amazing.
Oh, wow.
He's like a child prodigy when he was like 11. And then there's a chapter by Dr. Lou Cox in New York, who's worked with Aerosmith and Bon Jovi, and he's talking about what how bands are originally set up, and then how those sometimes those things don't last. It's a little bit, I guess I'm thinking about the way kind of defenses that we develop in childhood we outgrow as well. Anyway, so that's a section on kind of anger management and conflict resolutions in there as well. Then there's a section on anxiety and depression and crisis. What do you do if someone overdoses on your tour bus or someone has a heart attack? We kind of want you to know, what do you do if somebody's very depressed, and why might they be depressed? Then there's a section on stress, trauma, addiction and eating disorders. So it's bringing the link between traumatic stress and how that can be found at the core of people who are struggling with eating disorders sometimes, and addiction and things like that. And it talks all sorts of things in there. 2 more sections, one on bodily health. So we've got a medical physician who's a tour specialist, Dr. Arun Castro, sexual health chapter by Sital Panasar, which talks about things like consent in there as well, what to do if you've been assaulted on the road, as well as sexual health, vocal health, hearing health, sleep, nutrition. And then the final section is about self-care, preparation, recovery. So breathwork's in there, meditation, written by Rob DeBank, who runs festivals over here, Camp Festival, and used to have Festival as well. He's got a record label, peak performance, dealing with the media, and post-tour recovery, because it doesn't stop when you leave the tour.
That's the other thing that's interesting. Yeah, I want to kind of touch on all of those. But the one, depression seems to be the one that's most misunderstood from those on the outside, because it's always that, what can they be depressed about? How, it's got to be a dream gig. When I was a teen, I started listening to rock and roll. Like so many, I thought, man, that's like the perfect gig. While it has its definite upsides, of course, but there are many things that you have to be cautious of. What is life like for a musician on the road in general? Like the ups and downs and the usual stressors.
Well, look, the ups and downs is a good way to put it, but the ups and downs are very extreme. But before we get to ups and downs, I'd say, let's think about the experience of just leaving everything that keeps you stable at home, usually. Now, not everybody has that experience, and that's important to say. For some people, being on the road is the stable experience, and the sort of schedule and the predictability of things can keep things feeling contained. But for those who do have a stable home life, leaving the people and the places and, your usual yoga class, or knowing the local language and where to get food that, comforts you or that is familiar to you, all those things are some of the smaller building blocks that keep us feeling stable. So you take someone away from all of that, then you put them in this high pressure, high stress situation. And some of it's good stress, right? We call that eustress, meaning that it might not feel stressful. It might feel really, really good. It might feel exciting or like exhilarating, but you're still going to have a bit of a crash after that. And then you've got some real lows, like the loneliness, homesickness, and people have sort of conflict on the road with people that they're under this sort of pressure with. And you can't really have a down day. You can't have a bad day on the road. People do have down days, but if you've got loads of press to do, or you've got to get out there and give everybody, essentially the best night of their life, because it's really memorable for the audience, and you're feeling like, actually, I don't really want to be stared at by 30,000 people today. You kind of, you can't really, especially not in today's age with social media, you can't be gruff and grumpy and withdrawn and things like that. So it's a great deal of pressure, but the stress that people are under impacts their circadian rhythm, their ability to get good quality sleep, as well as things like sleeping on a tour bus, which can be quite difficult. Some people find it that the motion is quite soothing. Others find that the compactness and the motion and the heat when it parks up and the aircon's off.
Kip Winger just talked about that on an interview. He's like, I'm 61 years old, man. He goes, I just came off of a tour. He said, I spent 3/4 of my time in a bus, and however many hours on stage was minimal compared to all that. And he goes, I can't do it anymore. He goes, I don't know how much I can do. He prefers the airplane gigs, he said, where you can just go from one place to the other.
Right.
That's grueling, especially it's a young man's game too, and a young woman's game. You get older, it's not as enjoyable, not as fun, and you can't really endure it as long as maybe when you're in your 20s.
Exactly. You don't have the same physical resilience. So maybe the shine comes off a little bit as well. The first global tour you do, the first big tour you do, can feel quite exciting. You have new cultures, cuisines, all that kind of thing. It's a great opportunity. But, as it continues, you will start to notice, maybe it comes out in rashes, or it comes out physically in different ways after a couple of weeks. But I certainly couldn't do it. I mean, I don't like particularly going to hotel rooms, I've realized in my older age. If they're unfamiliar, or you're near the ice machine or the lift, or, it's not blackout blinds, or it's the wrong temperature, it's a different bed, all those things, they
So true.
contribute.
So true. When I was in college, I remember the bed in my dorm room, the wall was on the opposite side of the bed in my normal home. And in the middle of the night, I would bang my head up against the wall because I thought I was turning out instead of turning in. Yeah. How much introverts seem to be common in this business, which would surprise you, but there are introverts who really don't prefer being out in public, yet they have a passion for music. They love it. It's what they do. And really, they'd rather do that than anything else. So they're kind of forced into this situation. And that could lead to alcohol, drugs, just to get up on stage, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that performance anxiety can lead to people over drinking or using something to kind of quell the nerves. But as you said, there can be, some performers get a lot from the writing process. That's really where you get relief and catharsis, is sort of naming something that is very true and real for you and getting it out and creating. We know that the process of creativity is therapeutic, right? But it's everything that comes around that. Not everybody's a natural performer. Some people wrestle with it for years. Some people are, and they kind of, the elevated stress state that it is in their body, they can harness that. They can use that as a kind of, to sort of charge them up. For other people, it doesn't feel so good. It feels like anxiety. And without the right sort of tools, which we're hoping to give them in the book, they might turn to something, or they might find sort of quick fixes that then have other risks attached.
And it's probably not a simple answer as to what leads a musician down that path. I've said it many times. I'm wearing the Van Halen shirt here, but Eddie Van Halen, when he was a kid, 10, 11 years old, and he would perform with his dad on stage. And one day he said, I'm nervous, Dad, I'm nervous. I can't do it. And his father gave him a beer. And that was, from that point on, was the struggle that he would have all the way till the end. But the answer is not simple, right? As to what can lead somebody down that path.
No, it isn't. I mean, there are some things that are risk factors that, so the person who wrote that chapter, Dr. Susan Rayburn, she's over in LA, her parents were big band musicians, and sadly died prematurely from alcohol abuse, which led her into, studying this in the 80s. There are particular risk factors that you can be aware of, and early warning signs that we're trying to teach people of. But that anecdote you just said about Eddie Van Halen, I think there's some real significance there of both having that bonding experience of with his dad on stage. That was something that they did together. He appeals to his dad for comfort, for reassurance, and his dad endorses drinking. So that is very loaded, isn't it? Especially at that age.
Yep.
You're not going to kind of go, no, you're going to go, well, if dad says it's okay. And we have tour managers in a similar, not same role, but a parental role, sometimes enabling behavior because the show must go on, because their job is to get people out there and to feel okay about it, for sure. But that, though, there is more discussion around enabling behavior now than there has been previously. But that's one thing that came up in some of the interviews that I did for the book, people reflecting and looking back and thinking, God, I've facilitated some stuff over the years because I was so focused on doing my job and I didn't want to be fired. Nick Kua, so he works for Cher at the moment. He's amazing. And he talked about artists, he's very clear when he sets out a new relationship with an artist and says what he will and won't do. He says, look, if you're looking for someone to get you drugs or something, I really won't do that. And he talks about flushing coke down the loo and various other things. But it's complex because, for some people, sex, drugs, and rock and roll is all part of the reward for what you do, right?
Yes. You think it's cool. Now, I can tell you from my own personal perspective, my older brother, I didn't drink in high school, but my older brother had all his friends over and they would drink. And I just thought it was the coolest thing. And he loved rock and roll. So I just connected it all. And then when I got to college, I felt like in order to fit in, I had to drink in the dorm, and I did. And then I met my first girlfriend while I'm drinking. All those things, it took a long time for me to realize, because I just became like that weekend binge drinker. And it took a long time for me to realize, like, no, this isn't right. This isn't the way it's done. And then it stops being fun. And then it stops being fun to, then there's some dangerous roads you're going down. You're hanging around with some people that you shouldn't be hanging around with and all that stuff. And thankfully, I realized I didn't have the chemical makeup that I was addicted to it, because I did just stop. But I also benefited from friends getting married and moving on with their lives. So the temptations wasn't like, hey, let's go out, man. Let's go out every weekend. But that's the sex, drugs, and rock and roll. It's supposed to be cool, right?
Yeah, and you're also talking about it facilitating connection, right? That's which many drugs can, are social, right? So I guess if that becomes the way that you feel most confident or comfortable connecting with people, then you're going to not learn the skills of how to do that.
Or write music, right? A lot of them will tell you, I write my best music when I'm doing drugs or drinking. At least they think. Is that a fallacy?
To a point, I think there is a point of intoxication where you're not doing anything. You're not making much at all. And certainly, of course, if you're in the depths of depression or addiction, then you become less and less able to create, I suppose. I mean, maybe there's some truth to it up to a point, but then you also have artists like Paul Weller saying, since he stopped drinking, and he's been able to move through the discomfort that came with having to learn how to create and perform without it. He feels like he's got a much broader range of emotional expression. He feels things more deeply because he's not, subduing things or heightening things in a different way. Life's more real for him. I mean, I'm paraphrasing some of that, so don't quote me. But, I remember reading something, I thought, yeah, he's hit the nail on the head there, that one of the myths that we hear is, if I give this up, will I lose my creative spark? No, because your creative spark isn't found in the bottle or, the pill or whatever. It may enhance certain things and, it helps you get to a certain mental state. But there are other ways to reach that.
It's already in you. It's already in you. Yeah, it's there. Yeah, right. there are artists like Ace Frehley of Kiss is like more prolific now than when he was in Kiss, when he was battling drugs and alcohol, and now he's cranking out album after album. He's sober. And Aerosmith. You mentioned Aerosmith was another where when Joe Perry and Steven Tyler were just in the depths of their addiction to drugs and alcohol, the music suffered, the shows suffered. Once they get clean and sober, you have the late 80s resurgence, and everything is crystal clear to them creatively.
And you become more reliable as well, right? Because you can do more stuff. You can kind of be present more. your relationships improve, both with yourself and other people. And yeah.
What about, you write about what it takes to maintain both your physical and mental health on tour, a roadmap of healthy touring directed at artists, touring personnel, and the teams working around them. Improving individual resilience, you say, only takes you so far. It takes a group effort. What are some of the things that should be done collectively to benefit everyone while on the road?
That's a chapter where I was hoping, so that is the healthier touring chapter, I think, part of the introduction to that. What I'm hoping to do there is because at the moment, the current focus in mental health in the music industry is let's make this individual more resilient, which is like objectively helpful. We definitely want to do that. But if that, individual then continues to work in a dysfunctional setting, which touring can be, not always, but it can be, then that resilience will only take them so far. So this is about saying, let's wind it right back and we'll look at how the tour's set up. So it's things like there's some advice on what questions agents, promoters, managers can ask of the artist to try and get a sense of, if they've toured before, what's worked for them, what do they find difficult. It's basically identifying strengths and identifying problem areas where they might either need a bit of support, or you can anticipate and say, what, this particular experience is quite difficult for them, or at this point we need to build in something. So MI2C, Music Industry Therapist Collective, we're working with a band at the moment. So their manager's been coming to therapy, and he would like to support his artists who are going on a US tour soon. And so we're working, each individual artist is working with a therapist for a few sessions before they go out on the road, then around the halfway mark of that particular leg of the tour, and some work at the end as well to think about, okay, what's coming up for these individuals? How can we help them navigate that as a group? Improving communication. How can we, maybe somebody needs to build in a bit of physiotherapy at some point. So we're trying to think of different areas. Or somebody needs to, so one tip from the Justin Bieber tours that I always like to mention was Hailey Bieber instigated family hour at 4:00 every day for everyone on site, basically.
Yeah.
Everyone had to down tools and speak to their therapist, their loved one, and just, it's about fostering better connections, better working practices, and a more reasonable schedule and routing as well, thinking about the physical impact and stress impact of the way tours are laid out.
There's a great story in the book from Taylor Hanson of Hanson. He's among the musicians who contribute to this book. This is a great story. As children, they rocketed to fame in the 90s. Mm-hmm. And the song Mbop, I remember it. And they rode that roller coaster that comes after that kind of fame. And they're still together. And I saw them on a Beach Boys tribute recently, and you could just tell they just have that vibe that they're on solid ground, and they get it. They get what fame is all about, and they know how to handle it. There's a quote in the book that I wanted to get your thoughts on. Taylor said, quote, "Being able to control your own destiny is a lifesaver for your mental health. I see artists all the time who are living with the opposite approach. The problem with not going in with both eyes open is that ultimately you're running from responsibility like a child would. In exchange, you're giving up the confidence that comes with taking responsibility. In my experience, the more you take that responsibility, the more your art is free to exist." So here he's talking about how taking responsibility not only leads to a healthier life on the road, but he says it benefits his art. Can you talk about how important responsibility is, and also how easy it can be to avoid responsibility as a musician, because you can have people that just say yes to everything?
Yeah, absolutely. I love that quote too. He's
Yeah.
a really, really interesting person to interview. I guess one way I would think of that is about autonomy. We know that from decades of research that when your personal autonomy, as in your ability to self-govern and direct the course of your own life, is low, your mental health suffers. That's one of the challenges of being on the road. So you've usually got a tour manager, sometimes a day manager, and other staff around who are trying to take as much off your plate as possible so that you can feel fresh for your show or your interviews or whatever the sort of tasks are associated with your job. But usual day-to-day chores are handled by someone else usually, unless you're, DIY, just starting out, you're, tour managing yourself, etc. But what that does is it returns you to a kind of adolescent state where you've got this sort of conflict between having a great deal of pressure in some areas or responsibility in some areas, but a real reduction of responsibility in another, a reduction of the ability to choose. I spoke to one artist who said, I don't need people to choose where I drink my coffee every day. Like, she would have her go on her app or, her day sheets. It would say, great coffee in Berlin. You should go here. It's right next to your hotel. She's like, I can fucking Google. Excuse me.
Right.
But do you know what I mean?
Yes.
She can find her in. And I think we kind of, in an effort to be indispensable, tour managers sometimes contribute to this reduced autonomy, which you then see coming out in what you might think of as regressive behaviors. Because just like a teenager sometimes pushes back because they push it back against the boundaries and the limitations on them because they want to have more responsibility, but they're very frustrated sometimes. You sometimes see that on the road. You see, people protesting or they'll, try, if they're sort of trapped with a feeling that they can't really do anything about, they might not feel in control of things, so they might start feeling more anxious, and they might take more substances as well to sort of numb out, right?
Well, one of the most publicized stories of somebody who just nobody said no to him was Elvis. Could there have been something done to save him or someone in his situation? What I mean by that is, because it does come down to that person too. They have to make that decision.
I don't know a huge amount about Elvis. I watched that film, which I thought was great. I wonder sometimes whether, and this is, maybe veering into slightly conspiracy theory sort of areas, but I think it's fair to say that sometimes it's been in the industry or the person who's, managing the artist, it's been in their interest to keep them compliant and to sometimes feed or ignore or enable addictions and dependencies. But I spoke with agent Emma Banks, and she works with some huge people, I think Red Hot Chili Peppers and Florence and the Machine, people like that. And she said she was describing the change she saw in an artist that she'd worked with just from the beginning. And she said, on tour, they started to be separated from the rest of the group, i.e. they were encouraged to get first class tickets and seats when other people were in business or, coach or something. And there was some encouragement of a particular behavior, of a sense of, look, you're special, you're different, you deserve only the best. You're going to get used to that after a while. Some people don't. Some people have a remarkable ability to be grounded, and they are protected from that. Like the Hanson brothers, I think, is a good example. Their parents were quite, they continued their schooling during all of that. They said, look, ride this way for as long as it lasts. It's probably not going to last forever. There's another quote in the book where he's talking, maybe it's the same one, about that sense of specialness and what can happen if you let yourself believe that you're exceptional, and how that can get in the way. So I think that I've probably gone off piece here a little bit, but yes,
no, it makes sense.
Responsibility for sure, but yeah.
Dave Matthews had a great story about it. I read it in Rolling Stone once. He said, I have people around me that I make sure I tell them, if my ego gets out of control, let me know. And then I think he was talking about he had the same car that he was driving before he got money, and he just kept it because it kept him grounded. And I thought that was very interesting. And you see him, and he seems like that type of guy. Fame didn't get to his head.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great, it's a really great example. You want people to tell you the truth. Part of what can be so disorientating and can make you feel isolated is that, as you said earlier, these kind of yes men, these people that just want to keep you happy and that will downplay your flaws. And we all have them, right? So it's kind of realizing that, there will be times that you mess up or that you're difficult to be around, and owning that, and also saying, I want you to, tell me the truth. You need people that will tell you the truth. That's why people come to therapy.
The Booked on Rock podcast will be back after this. Are you an author or publisher with a rock-based book to promote? If so, the Booked on Rock podcast is looking for guests.
Promote them all, I say.
Send an email to the Booked on Rock podcast @gmail.com. That's the Booked on Rock podcast @gmail.com. Or you can contact the podcast through the Booked on Rock website, bookedonrock.com.
It just arrived. I think it's your new book.
And be sure to keep us in the loop for any upcoming book releases related to rock and roll.
That took guts. I'm promoting you.
Tamsin Embleton is our guest. The book is called Touring and Mental Health, a Music Industry Manual. Chapter 7 is titled Why Successful Bands Fail. Again, going back to my favorite band, Van Halen, a word often used to describe them is dysfunctional. To this day, Wolfgang Van Halen is always asked, are you guys going to release anything that your dad made back in the day in the vaults? And he said, they asked him, are they going to do a tribute to Eddie? What's going to, and he said, this band has always been so dysfunctional. They still are. But of course, they weren't the only band to implode over time. So this happens so often. Can you talk about the factors that lead to a band who is as tight as can be when they first get together? It's all for one for all. And then eventually everything falls apart.
So that's the chapter I talked about earlier that Lou Cox writes, and he talks about it being ego, essentially. He talks about different sort of ego types, different descriptions for how an ego might sort of characteristics of a particular ego type. And he talks about how, there are competing interests and conflicts of interest, amongst the band members. They have to have a sort of shared goal, they have to have a shared vision, shared ethical framework, they have to have really good communication skills, and he gives guidance on how to do that. But like one common thing that we often hear might be, often when bands first start out, there is the sense of kind of equality, and enthusiasm often when the band is first set up. So they might agree particular splits of royalties, etc. based
That's
on
the
this.
Big one. Yeah.
Right.
Publishing royalties. Yeah.
Yeah, but then later down the line, someone's not pulling their weight, or someone actually does the lion's share of the work over here, or they write more, or whatever it is, and the dynamic shifts and changes, and tensions appear, and it feels unfair. Or so I think I really like Lou's chapter, and actually he's got a great book all about this, his kind of theories and insights around ego from the bands that he's worked with. I think it's just called Ego. But yeah, I think it's really helpful to recognize what we're bringing into a space in a group, how groups can recreate family dynamics, which they often do. There's can be sibling rivalries and tensions, and people taking particular roles, people being like the golden child or the scapegoat. So we talk about that in a later chapter. You see it in all dysfunctional groups. That's a theory that comes from studying families of alcoholics, I think, or maybe addicts more broadly, but that there's often these kind of ways that the groups position people, and then if you try and move position, the group will unconsciously sort of try and put you back.
Pressure. You did bring that up, I believe, earlier. Michael Jackson had a ton of pressure to repeat the massive success of that album, Thriller. It's pressure he put on himself, from what I heard him say in interviews. He always wanted to reach that height of success from that point on. Never was able to, because it's impossible. But what's the greatest danger that comes with success, and how do you overcome that type of pressure that you can put on yourself to repeat something that's really, you can't repeat the success of an album like Thriller?
No, I mean, I don't know if anybody has since,
No.
I mean, that was extraordinary, right? But I guess there's something about what is the feeling you're trying to recreate, what is the state. So when you have a high like that, it's very difficult to replicate, and some people can chase it for years, and they may chase it through sex, drugs, and rock and roll. They may chase it in different ways. So it's kind of what I would encourage someone to do, say in a therapy session, would be to really open up. What was that experience like for you? What did it mean? What did it feel like? How did it change your perception of yourself and the world? Why was it so intoxicating? Why is it so important to go back there? What is it like now that it's over, or you're plateauing, which is, what most people's careers do, if you're lucky, let's say. You might have a high, you might, and then very few people maintain at a particular level. But, we also think about other types of reward, other types of perhaps more lasting, more sustainable ways to feel good about yourself, connected to other people, or to express, So, for example, people may feel, I've just got to get that Grammy, just got to get it. If I get that Grammy, I'm going to feel fucking amazing. I'm going to, that's going to restore my sense of self. It's going to show people, how important what I'm doing is, it will establish me or leave my mark on the world or something. Quite often, once you get those awards, if they come, you actually feel a bit deflated. You might even feel that a bit beforehand. It might not lead to all these things that you thought it do. Perhaps it does, propel your career forward, but it might not shift dramatically how you feel about yourself, So that's something that we also try and help people think about, what is deeply rewarding, and what is it telling you about what may need to be healed or accessed in yourself and your life.
What
If that
about,
doesn't all sound a bit...
no, it makes sense. It causes the depression because then you're thinking, well, I thought this is everything that I wanted. Why am I still unhappy? And then you start to turn on yourself. Like, what's wrong with me? You start to get mad at yourself. Like, come on, man, you got everything you want here. Why? Yeah, I totally see that. What kind of information have you gotten regarding, because a lot of these classic rock artists who are still going, they're in their 70s now, and we've got Paul McCartney, I think 79 or 80. He's the exception where he's still iconic and everybody goes to see him. But older artists have to deal with that difficulty of the younger generation takes over and they're no longer, it's like the Billy Joel line, every generation puts somebody at the top of the charts, but then you're in the bargain bin. And then where do we go with this now? And a lot of these artists too, they put out new music and it's often ignored, and they go out on tour. Everybody just wants to hear the hits. What kind of emotional effect can that have on an artist as they get older?
Well, one thing that stands out in what you said was, fear of losing relevance. And I think that's there for most artists. There can be at different stages in your career, they can come with different anxieties. Not everyone's anxious, but I would say a significant proportion of artists can be, and whether it's social or about different things. But there can be the anxiety of gaining success, then the anxiety of maintaining it, and then the fear of losing relevance. And what happens when you've been, everyone's been desperate to hear from you and hangs on your every word, and then suddenly you're much less interesting, the phone's not ringing anymore, actually you've got to pursue instead of being pursued. Or you're right, people are, I watch a lot of bands from the 80s. It's just my era. I don't know why. But, and they're playing music that they've been playing for, 30 years now?
Yeah.
A bit longer than that. And they have to find ways to keep it fresh and relevant and reconnect with, what's interesting about that. So they don't just feel like they're kind of, live jukebox players. But it can be difficult to feel like everybody's attached to a piece of work that you've moved on from, and actually what you're doing now is most relevant to you or most important to you. That's something that can be hard to reconcile as well, if everyone's just asking you to play Africa if you're Toto, for example.
Yes. Yeah, right. It's so true. But you brought up anxiety. Most artists are anxious people. That's what Neil Barnes of the British group Left Field says. Why is that so, and how do you overcome it?
Well, I mean, I think why it's so can be quite a complex thing to answer. So there can be lots of reasons why people can feel anxious, from sort of biological predispositions. Maybe their nervous system is more sensitive to change and stress in the environment, or they have, genetic inheritance that makes them more predisposed, or attachment relationships. So relationships with primary caregivers in your early childhood, if there's been insecure attachments there, that can lead to a sense of insecurity and anxiety in later life. Job insecurity and financial insecurity, really common in the industry.
Not much in that business, right?
Right. And if you're constantly hustling, or you're constantly going, what I'm doing is important, please listen to me, that's, there's something, there's going to be a psychological impact to that. What you can do, well, it really depends on you and where your anxiety is located, I think. But we've got a few chapters on anxiety. So there's one that talks about general anxiety disorders. That's Dr. Martin Seif, I think, who's over in Connecticut. And he's also done a fear of flying chapter, which can be downloaded on touringmanual.com for free. And then there's music performance anxiety, which is very specific. It's more common in people that have general anxiety disorders, but it's, specifically about music performance. And strategies like acceptance and commitment therapy is very helpful for that. Learning healthy ways to decompress, reframing anxious thoughts and feelings, learning to sort of build a greater tolerance to anxious feelings in the body, to reground, to notice when your thinking's gone catastrophic, or, to be able to sort of recognize when the core of anxiety is you overestimate threat and you underestimate your ability to cope. So we can improve how someone copes and improve how their ability to properly assess how threatening a situation is.
Self-sabotage, that's another one. I just interviewed Nina Antonio, who wrote a great book on Johnny Thunder from the New York Dolls, and he died at 38, and he was just drugs and alcohol were his problem from the time he really got on stage, and self-sabotaging was something he would do. The bigger the gig, when it would be a gig where there'd be record label guys there was a lot on the line, his bandmate said he always had this cycle he'd go in. He'd do more drugs. He would almost like psychologically, he's setting himself up for failure. Like, is it that he doesn't feel he's worthy of that type of success? Is it a self-esteem thing? Is that what self-sabotaging is?
Perhaps. I think, again, it may vary for people. I think sometimes you may unconsciously be trying to control the outcome. If you change the outcome intentionally, then you're controlling the outcome. Well, I didn't really try because I wasn't very present, or, I didn't go to rehearsals or sound check or something. Then you're kind of trying to control how risky it feels to you. But it can be, let's not underestimate what it's like to step out on stage, to be watched and potentially scrutinized, and have to, captivate people. I mean, what a challenge.
Now more than ever with YouTube. Are you kidding me? Everybody picks apart every little performance. Oh, he sounded terrible there. Listen to him. Back in the day, you'd have a bad show and nobody would know about it unless the people that were there. And even the people that were there were having such a good time, they didn't even notice. They couldn't tell the guy, he had a note that was off or whatever. Boy, yeah, that is social media. It's like every move you make, that's got to be tough. But then you have those who are grounded, and you mentioned Bon Jovi. John Bon Jovi is a great example. He married his high school girlfriend, and they are still together. Being away all the time while touring and also while recording albums can be challenging on a relationship. How can a musician maintain a long, healthy relationship while on tour?
Improving communication and anticipating what the challenges might be like. So I came across a great article by a lighting designer called Chris Luce, and he describes exit friction just before someone goes on tour that can surface in a romantic relationship, and entry friction. So people think, oh, you're going to come home and this is what you've been longing to do, and everyone's going to be excited to see you and you'll reconnect and it'll feel great. Quite often that's not as easy as that. You've got people in different headspaces who have been, different things have been neglected for each of them. Maybe they both need a bit of care. And sometimes people can miss each other. So it's anticipating the challenges of connecting on the road when you're in different headspaces and time zones. And, you're trying to get a bit of privacy, which can be hard to get. I know a lot of touring couples that have therapy that helps them put it somewhere and be held by someone else, to helps normalize the stresses and strains. And I think the person at home really has to have something for themselves in their life. We have the touring person has to maybe adjust to what's happening at home rather than expect the world to revolve around them when they get back. Other person and their family have been, if those the family have been continuing life, and you have to a certain degree slot into that and slowly reconnect.
From a physical standpoint, I see guys like Bruce Springsteen or Sting are always in great shape. And I wonder how hard that must be while on the road. I do remember, this is in the 90s, John Mellencamp was playing a show nearby, and somebody I knew said they saw him in our local gym. And I thought, well, that's pretty cool. So, because I always thought maybe they had their own physicians, or they got a nice setup on the bus or whatever where they can work out. But obviously not always the case. I guess, they have people that would find the nearest gym or whatever so they can stay in shape. But that seems to be a big challenge, because also you could just grab junk food very easily on the road. You could do all those things. So I'm sure the bigger artists, it might be a little easier.
Yeah, some artists travel with their personal trainer as well as a personal chef and various other, when you've got a bit of cash, you've got more flexibility there. But I think trying to have a routine is very helpful. Likewise, some venues are now using spare space backstage creatively, having like chill out rooms or having a room where people can stretch and do weights or something like that. I know some artists that take fold-up bikes on the tour bus. Nile Rodgers crew do that sometimes. Actually, there's an organization called Fit on Tour who specialize in giving advice on exercising in small spaces like hotel rooms. But I think one of the things is you might want to think about the culture of your particular touring group. If the touring party, each tour has a bit of its own feel to it. There's a particular group of people, a particular point of time, and you have to be quite disciplined to go against that touring culture. There can be peer pressure essentially to drink heavily after the show, or you're trying to come down, so it's tempting to, from the high from the show, so it's tempting to drink very heavily or eat a pizza or something that's then going to disrupt your sleep later. So you have to be quite disciplined to say, actually, I'm going to rest my voice, I'm going to get an early night, and I'm going to run tomorrow or something, and figure out. I mean, there's other people on the road that if they have a particular class, then they'll look into where the class is if they're in like Baltimore or wherever.
David Payton, he toured with Elton John, and he was at Live Aid with him and all that stuff. And he said when he returned, I think he toured with Elton in the mid 80s when Elton was still having substance abuse problems. And then he rejoined him later when Elton was clean and sober. And he said after the shows, he said he was waiting for the party. And Elton just is like heading back to his room. See you later. I'm done. Going back to my room. It was like a whole different thing. Alice Cooper had a story where he was a heavy drinker, and he got himself cleaned up late 80s, and he had this routine, a ritual. He loved chocolate. So he'd have a few chocolate bars and watch his favorite TV shows, like very un-rock and roll. But, you see a guy like Alice Cooper now, and Elton too, the reason that they're still going is because they made that conscious effort. It's up to them to say, no more. You guys, if you want to go to the bar, you go ahead, but I'm going back to my room.
And they've found their rituals or their ways of regrounding themselves and comforting themselves in a way that's not ultimately harmful to them.
Winding down here, and you did mention this earlier, the difficulty for musicians once they get off stage. They've experienced this tremendous high from the crowd. To come down from that must be extremely difficult. What does the musician experience mentally and emotionally those minutes after walking off stage? And how do you come down from that on a nightly basis? Like, is there a routine? Is it meditation? Is it just going to a quiet room? What is it that you can do?
Well, we know that performance involves lots of different hormones, one of which is cortisol, the stress hormone. So regardless of how well practiced you are, how big the audience is, playing music without an audience reduces cortisol. Playing music in front of an audience increases it. And sometimes it can go as high as the cortisol produced when you skydive. So that's a lot buzzing around in your body. Some people get off stage and try and extend that high, try and prevent what's called the post-show blues. So that is the crash that follows. That's a really vulnerable time. It's when you might hear of more artists overdosing, for example, drinking really heavily or taking substances really intensely, trying to prevent feelings of loneliness maybe. So you've gone from intense connection to being at some stage alone in your hotel room perhaps. So it's where you're a bit more at risk if you have vulnerabilities in particular areas. So having a post-show routine, just giving yourself a minute for a start, some basic boundaries around holding back the label people or whoever's there who wants to say hi and congratulate you for the show. Give yourself 15 minutes if you can in your dressing room just to regroup and sort of resettle. That's not a good time to talk about how well you thought the show went and whether Dave missed a beat on the second track or whatever. We could talk about that another day. It's a vulnerable time, so you want to resettle. You can help support your nervous system through, as you said, breath work, meditation, things like that, active relaxation, but use sort of cooling your body temperature is very effective. So having a shower that goes from warm to cool, having an ice pack that you use on your forehead or your wrists, things like that can help calm down that at what we would call arousal in the body, that heightened state. And resetting, eating something, but not something that's going to be really difficult to digest on the tour bus or wherever you're going to be. So having something like a chicken salad wrap or something. There's a nutrition chapter. She discusses what to eat pre and post show. Just having something that is just yours, maybe checking in with someone. Maybe you've got a buddy on the road who's also sober, if that's, what's going on for you, and sort of having ways to check in with people. And I like the idea of watching something and, having a bit of a treat. So you want to mark, if you want to celebrate, okay, great. We'll have some good alternatives instead of whatever your usual vice is, so that you could have still got a way to celebrate and mark the end of the show.
Paul Stanley of Kiss wrote in his book that after the show, he had a lot of difficulty with having such adulation from the females in in the crowd to then being all alone in a diner. It's
quite
but
a
that's what it
contrast,
is.
isn't it?
Yeah, quite the contrast. Yeah. And when the tour ends, there's that adjustment going from the roller coaster ride on the road to regular day-to-day life. And this is something we often don't even think about. What are the difficulties musicians face when they come off the road?
But they might feel displaced. They've got used to their bodies, their minds have got used to a particular way of doing things, a particular routine. And you can come home feeling de-skilled, like you don't know how to look after yourself very well because you've been out of practice. Fruit doesn't come all chopped up on a platter. You've got to, there's certain things that you have to readjust to, or reacclimatize to even. It's like kind of coming back down from this incredible adventure, but having to acclimatize to ordinary civilian life and what that feels like. So you may miss the big highs of performance and camaraderie with your mates on the road and things like that, but you have different responsibilities at home. There's different things asked of you. You may be sick as well. People get post-tour.
You mentioned that in the book. Yeah.
People get ill after tour because of all that cortisol has affected every system of their body, including their immunity. So people may get respiratory issues or post-tour flu. It's quite common. Some people get skin issues and stuff as well. So you might need a bit of time to let your body. Some people extend the tour for a day or two in a hotel on their own, just using the facilities there and just having a bit of time to themselves before they re-enter, society and home life.
Great Joe Walsh song, Ordinary Average Guy, talks about taking the trash out and cleaning up the dog doo.
Right. Yeah. Imagine doing that after you've just been headlining Wembley or whatever.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Are there legal aspects now in the business these days? Because back in the day, you'd hear stories about bands. If a band member gets injured, breaks his arm, breaks his wrist. I just mentioned this the last episode with somebody, but there was an author of a book on the band Uriah Heep, and one of the band members broke his hand or his arm or something, and their tour manager was like, "We're not going to the emergency room. You're just going to go out and play again tomorrow night." It was that kind of thing. Are there insurance plans in place nowadays with these bands to protect the artist from being abused maybe by the business, who view them as a commodity?
Yes and no. So, there is certainly insurances on tours, and there are other, I think the Roadie Clinic actually have just launched this very cheap insurance people can get by the day for tours in the States. Actually, it's worth looking at. I think it's called Tour Doc, or is it Roadie Doc? Anyway, but look, there are always going to be difficulties with rock docs, as we call them, people who may have an interest, or maybe, what's the most diplomatic way of saying this? So, okay, Michael Jackson, as you were talking about earlier, his physician was convicted in the end because of what he was supplying Michael with that went against the core principles and ethical framework he's supposed to work at. People can get quite starry-eyed around people of status and power and fame, and it can lead them to oversubscribing drugs to keep that person happy. Some artists are getting drugs from the promoter's doctor in Minneapolis and then going to LA and seeing a hotel doctor there, and so there's no one overseeing this polypharmacy, this multiple medication use, which is of course high risk. So we talk a little bit about some of the ethics and the duty of care there that needs to be thought about. There are some cases that are happening and have happened, like for example Little Peep, who, I can't remember the year he died, was it 2017 perhaps?
Not long ago, and his mother took the management, I think I want to get this right, management and the tour manager, I can't remember, to court. I think they settled out of court in the end. I imagine now that it's very clear what the risks are in touring and in musician careers, we may see more cases, and I think that's how things will change. Unfortunately, I think that is how standards will be set. Currently, we don't have, for example, healthy standards about what is how many shows in a row is too intense. I'd suggest, 3 and then a day off and then 2, and for example, but we don't have those guidelines yet. So some tours are just going
health for leather, especially after COVID, trying to recoup lost earnings and momentum, with thinking that, this is short term, we've just got to get through it. But sometimes that's really coming at a human cost.
As a fan, it's important too, because we love our music. Music is so important, and we want to see our favorite artist healthy. This book, I think, will do a lot for musicians. And like I said, I think this book is going to be around for a long time. It's going to be like the go-to manual for musicians, and not just musicians, but it's also for the roadies and there's a huge crew that goes out on the road with these artists. Yeah. So a touring and mental health, the music industry manual, it is out now through Omnibus Press, right?
Yeah, you can find it in Amazon in the States. I think there's a couple of other shops. I can't quite remember what they're called, but we're just working on the audiobook now as well, which will have clips from all the interviews and things like that. So that'll be available hopefully end of this year, early next year. Excellent.
Yes. Where could people find you online, Tamsin, if anybody wants to reach out to you?
They can find me at Tamsin Embleton, or embletonpsychotherapy.com, and musicindustrytherapist.com, or at wearemitc, and then the book is touringmanual.com.
Great. Yeah, I'll put the links in the show notes page. Thank you so much, Tamsin. This was great.
Thank you. Yeah, it's been a pleasure. Thanks a lot for having me on.
That's it. It's in the books.